Ex-girlfriend. I had just broken up with Stephanie a week ago. It was the end of my sophomore year in college, and things had taken a turn for the worse between us. What started as a seemingly perfect relationship had spiraled into something I couldn't control. Her jealousy, her constant need to know where I was and who I was with, her obsessive behavior. I couldn't breathe, and I had to get out. But I never expected what followed. I live in one of those older dorms on campus, the kind that makes you feel like you're in a time capsule from the 1970s. The floors creak, the walls are thin, and the whole building has this musty smell that never quite goes away. My room is on the 3rd floor, down a long hallway that always seems darker than it should be, even during the day. My roommate, Dave, is often out late with his girlfriend, so I get a lot of time alone. Normally, I didn't mind, but lately, I've started feeling uneasy. It began with small things, texts from unknown numbers, my things being slightly out of place, and that unnerving feeling of being watched. It was Wednesday night, around 10 p.m., and I was sitting at my desk trying to focus on a term paper. The room was dimly lit by the small lamp on my desk, the kind that casts long shadows on the walls. My phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen and saw another text from an unknown number. "Why did you leave me, Mark? I miss you." I ignored it, putting my phone face down on the desk and tried to concentrate. But a few minutes later, it buzzed again. "You can't just walk away. We were meant to be together. I'll always be with you." I swallowed hard and pushed my chair back from the desk. The room suddenly felt too small, the walls too close. I got up and walked to the door, locking it, as if that would somehow keep her out. I sat back down, but the unease didn't go away. My eyes kept drifting to the window, which was slightly open, letting in the cool night air. The trees outside rustled gently, their branches casting eerie shadows across the floor. I was just about to get up and close it when my phone buzzed again. "I know you're alone right now. I'm always watching you, Mark. Don't you feel it?" I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the blood rushing in my ears. How did she know I was alone? Was she outside? I stood up slowly and approached the window, my hand trembling as I reached out to close it. But something made me stop. Something I saw outside in the darkness. There was someone standing under the streetlight across from the dorm, just at the edge of the parking lot. It was hard to make out who it was, but they were definitely staring up at my window. I felt a chill run down my spine. I stepped back from the window, my mind racing. Was it Stephanie? It had to be her. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed Dave's number. He didn't pick up. Of course, he was probably with his girlfriend. I texted him quickly, telling him to come back to the dorm as soon as he could. Then, I did the only thing I could think of. I called the campus security office. They answered after a few rings, and I told them there was someone suspicious outside my dorm. They said they'd send someone over to check it out. I hung up, feeling a little better, but still on edge. I sat back down at my desk, but I couldn't focus on my paper anymore. I kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see someone there. 20 minutes passed. I heard a knock on my door, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. I walked over slowly, peering through the peephole. It was one of the campus security officers. I opened the door, trying to act casual, but I could tell he noticed my unease. "We checked the area," he said, "but we didn't see anyone around. Are you sure you saw someone?" I nodded, but now I was starting to doubt myself. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe this breakup was making me paranoid, but I could still feel that creeping sense of dread, that feeling that I was being watched. And since I knew the stereotype of strong men, I didn't tell the officer that I was afraid of my ex-girlfriend. A really stupid belief, I know. I locked the door behind him and stood there for a moment, trying to gather myself. The room felt oppressive, the air thick with tension. I decided to take a shower, hoping it would help me relax. I grabbed my towel and headed to the bathroom down the hall. The bathroom was empty, as it usually was this late at night. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering slightly. I turned on the shower, letting the steam fill the room. The sound of the water was soothing, drowning out my thoughts for a few minutes. But as I stood there, I heard something, faint but distinct. A soft, shuffling sound, like someone moving quietly just outside the bathroom door. I turned off the water, my heart racing again. The shuffling stopped. I listened intently, every nerve in my body on edge. Then I heard it again, closer this time, right outside the door. I quickly wrapped the towel around myself and stepped out of the shower, my wet feet slapping against the cold tile floor. I reached for the door handle, my hand shaking, and slowly opened it. The hallway was empty, but something was off. The door to my dorm room, which I knew I had locked, was slightly ajar. My breath caught in my throat. I walked down the hall as quietly as I could, my heart pounding in my ears. I reached the door and pushed it open slowly, peering inside. The room was dark, the only light coming from the glow of my laptop on the desk. I stepped inside cautiously, looking around. Everything seemed in place, but then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was a message scrawled on the wall above my bed, in what looked like red lipstick. "You can't hide from me, Mark. I'll always find you." I stumbled back, my mind reeling. How did she get in? How long had she been here? I felt a wave of nausea hit me as I realized she could still be in the room. I turned to leave, but then I saw her. She was standing in the corner, partially hidden in the shadows, her eyes wide and crazed. Stephanie. She was holding something in her hand, something that glinted in the dim light. "You thought you could get rid of me?" she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and desperation. "You thought you could just walk away?" I backed up slowly, my mind racing for a way out. But the door was behind her, and she was blocking my only escape. "Please, Stephanie," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "You don't have to do this." She took a step forward, the object in her hand catching the light. A knife. My stomach dropped. "I gave you everything," she said, her voice breaking. "And you just threw me away." I tried sweet-talking her, telling her that it was a mistake and how much I loved her, but she seemed to be completely out of it. I had to do something, had to get out of here. I glanced around the room, looking for anything I could use, anything to distract her. But before I could make a move, she lunged at me, the knife raised high. I barely had time to react. Luckily, she was a rather small woman, and I managed to kick her in the chest before she reached me. The knife clattered to the floor, and I shoved her away with all the strength I had. She stumbled back, hitting the wall hard. I pinned her down to the ground and called for help. When one of my friends arrived, he immediately knew what was up and called the police. She was taken away, her eyes never leaving mine as they led her out. That night, I didn't go back to my room. I stayed with a friend in another dorm, unable to sleep. the events of the night replaying in my mind over and over. I couldn't shake the feeling of her presence, her voice whispering in my ear. Afterwards, I got a restraining order against her. I never saw Stephanie again. She was expelled, and I heard she was getting some kind of help. But the damage was done. Even now, I can't walk down that hallway without feeling a chill, without looking over my shoulder, expecting to see her standing there, watching me. She said she'd always find me, and some nights, when the dorm is quiet, I believe she will. I see you. It was early November of 2021 when I first moved into the small, weathered house on the outskirts of town. My last apartment had been a disaster. Thin walls, noisy neighbors, and a rent that made me question my life choices. This house, though a bit run down, was at least a place where I could have some peace and quiet. The place was small, just one bedroom, a cramped kitchen, and a living room that barely fit my worn-out couch and second-hand TV. It sat at the end of a long gravel driveway, surrounded by dense woods. The only other house nearby was an old farmhouse about a mile down the road, which looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. I moved in on a cold, overcast day. The kind of day that makes you want to curl up under a blanket and forget the world exists. After unloading my stuff, I spent the first evening settling in, arranging my books on the sagging shelves and setting up my coffee maker, my one essential luxury. By nightfall, the wind had picked up, howling through the trees and rattling the old windows. The house creaked and groaned like it was alive, but I told myself it was just the wind, nothing to be worried about. I made myself a cup of tea, sat down with a book, and tried to ignore the unsettling sounds outside. It was around midnight when I first saw it. The motion sensors on the porch went off. I was shocked for a second, but at first I told myself that it must be some animal. After all, the woods were just a few 100 meters away from my new home. But then something else happened. A quiet but noticeable tap on my living room window. I got up and got closer to it in order to convince myself that I wasn't going crazy. There it was, clear as day. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't like the random noises of the house settling or the wind against the glass. This was deliberate, almost rhythmic. I put down my book and walked over to the window. The living room light was off, and the only illumination came from the dim lamp by my chair. I stood there, peering out into the dark, but saw nothing. Just shadows and the vague outline of trees swaying in the wind. The tapping had stopped, and I convinced myself that there must be a normal explanation for it. Be that an animal trying to take a peek inside, or just an old house making strange noises. Still, I felt uneasy, a nagging sense of dread curling in the pit of my stomach. The next morning, I decided to check outside, just to put my mind at ease. I circled the house, looking for anything that could have caused the noise. There were no trees close enough to the window, no loose shutters, nothing. The ground beneath the window was undisturbed, save for a few scattered leaves. I shook it off and went about my day, but the thought kept gnawing at me. That night, the tapping returned. This time, it was louder, more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly approached the window. I wanted to throw open the curtains and confront whatever was out there, but a deep, primal fear rooted me to the spot. Instead, I stood there, frozen, waiting for something, anything to happen. Then, the tapping stopped. I barely slept that night, jumping at every creak and groan of the old house. The following day, I called my friend Mark, who lived about an hour away. I told him about the noises, the tapping, how it was starting to freak me out. Mark, a good friend, was concerned for me and told me he would come over that night. Mark arrived that evening, armed with a flashlight and a six-pack of beer. We spent the first hour joking around, trying to lighten the mood, but as night fell, the atmosphere grew tense. We sat in the living room, the TV on low. We were basically waiting for something bad to happen. Mark kept the flashlight close, ready to find out what was causing my distress. Then, just as I was beginning to think it wouldn't happen, there it was. Tap, tap, tap. Mark jumped up, clicking on the flashlight and aiming it at the window. But all we saw was our own reflections staring back at us. He moved closer, his breath fogging up the glass as he squinted into the night. Nothing. No sign of movement, no rustling in the bushes, just the dark, empty yard. Mark decided to go outside and check around the house, just to be sure. I watched from the window as he circled the yard, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. He disappeared around the corner, and for a few minutes, everything was silent. Then I heard him shout, his voice filled with alarm. I bolted to the door and ran outside, my heart in my throat. I found Mark standing at the back of the house, his flashlight trained on something in the grass. I followed the light and felt my stomach drop. There, scratched into the dirt, were the words, "I see you." We didn't stick around after that. We bolted back into the house, grabbed my keys, and drove straight to Mark's place. I didn't care that I was leaving everything behind. I just needed to get out of there. I think I even left the door open. I went back the next day during daylight with Mark and a couple of other friends. The words were still there, clear as day, and the ground beneath the window looked like it had been disturbed, like someone had been standing there watching me. As a group, we came to the only logical conclusion, being that a stalker or homeless person must be living inside the old farmhouse or the nearby woods. Whoever it was too dangerous to stay there. I moved out that same day, but to this day I still get chills every time I hear a strange sound at night. And I wonder what might have happened to me if I stayed inside this house one day longer, or if I had checked the house's surroundings by myself that night. The co-worker. It all started with what seemed like innocent gestures. I worked in a small office, the kind where everyone knew each other's business, whether you liked it or not. It was a quiet place, just a handful of us working there, so any change in the usual routine stood out like a sore thumb. That's probably why I noticed Carl's attention more than I would have if we'd worked in a bigger place. Carl was new. He'd started a few months ago. He was polite, kept to himself mostly, but he had this awkwardness about him that made people a bit uncomfortable. You know the type, always lingering a second too long in a conversation, his eyes not quite meeting yours. At first, I chalked it up to nerves. Everyone's a bit awkward when they start a new job, right? It wasn't long before Carl started paying more attention to me. It began with small talk in the break room, nothing too odd. But then he started showing up at my desk with coffee, saying he'd grabbed an extra by mistake. I never asked for it, but I thanked him anyway, trying to be polite. Maybe he was just trying to make friends. Then he began complimenting me, almost daily. "You look nice today, Lisa," he'd say with that strange smile of his. It made my skin crawl. and he wasn't even bad looking either. So it wasn't the typical situation where a nice gesture only seems weird because the guy is unattractive. It wasn't just the words. It was the way he said them, as if he were savoring each syllable. I didn't want to overreact, but it started to make me uncomfortable. I decided to keep my distance, avoiding him when I could. One day, Carl asked if I wanted to grab a drink after work. The idea of spending time with him outside of the office made my stomach turn. I politely declined, saying I had plans, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't used to hearing no. That's when things started to change. At first, it was subtle. I'd see him watching me from across the office, his gaze never wavering. I'd catch him standing a little too close behind me when I was talking to someone else, close enough that I could feel his breath on my neck. It was unnerving, but I convinced myself it was all in my head. He was just a weird guy, nothing more. Then, a few weeks after I turned him down, things escalated. I started getting the feeling that someone was watching me outside of work too. It sounds crazy, I know, but I'd catch glimpses of a figure out of the corner of my eye when I was out running errands, or I'd hear footsteps behind me that would stop the moment I turned around. It was always just out of sight, just out of reach, but enough to keep me on edge. One night, I came home late after grabbing dinner with a friend. I was exhausted, ready to crash. But as I walked up to my front door, I noticed something odd. The door was unlocked. I could have sworn I'd locked it when I left. My heart began to race, and I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I pushed the door open slowly, every creak of the hinges sounding like a gunshot in the silent night. I stepped inside, flipping on the light, half expecting to see what? I didn't know, but nothing was out of place. Everything looked just as I'd left it. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I checked every room, every closet, under the bed. Nothing. I was being paranoid, I told myself. Work stress, maybe, or just too many horror movies. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't sleep. Every little noise had me sitting up, listening, straining to hear anything out of the ordinary. I kept telling myself to calm down, that I was safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next day at work, Carl was nowhere to be seen. It should have been a relief, but instead, it made me even more anxious. I couldn't stop thinking about the unlocked door. Maybe I was overreacting, but I couldn't shake the thought that Carl had something to do with it. When I got home that evening, everything seemed normal. I tried to relax, telling myself I'd just been jumpy the night before. But as I sat on my couch, flipping through the channels, I started to feel it again, that creeping sensation that someone was watching me. I glanced at the windows, checking the locks, but they were all secure. Still, the feeling wouldn't go away. Then I heard it, a faint creak from upstairs, like the sound of someone shifting their weight on the floorboards. My blood ran cold. I muted the TV and strained to listen. The house was silent, but that one noise had set off every alarm in my body. Slowly I stood up, grabbing the nearest thing I could find, a heavy lamp from the side table. My hands were shaking as I crept toward the stairs. Step by step, I ascended, each one feeling like it took an eternity. When I reached the top, I paused, holding my breath. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the bathroom nightlight. I moved toward my bedroom, the door slightly ajar. I pushed the door open with the lamp, my heart pounding in my ears. The room was dark, but there was a shadow, a figure standing by the window. The streetlight outside cast just enough of a glow to reveal his face. It was Carl. He was just standing there, staring out the window and searching my drawer. I froze, unable to move, my mind racing with what to do next. The next few moments were a blur, shouting, the sound of something crashing to the floor, my own scream echoing in my ears. I don't remember how I got out of the house, but the next thing I knew, I was running down the street, my phone clutched in my hand as I dialed 911. The police arrived quickly, but Carl was gone by the time they searched the house. They found signs that he'd been starting to build a small camp in my attic. Food wrappers, a sleeping bag, even some of my personal belongings stashed away in his makeshift camp. He was arrested later that day, found by a police patrol. The police told me he'd been watching me for months, that he had plans to do something far worse than just scare me. It's been over a year now, and I've moved far away from that house, from that town. But I still can't shake the feeling that someone is watching me, that Carl is still out there, waiting for another chance. Every creak, every shadow, every time I feel like I'm not alone, I remember that night, and I wonder if I'll ever truly feel safe again.